Okay, so today I want to talk about the two essays that I've given you for homework last time, Ideological State Apparatuses by Louis Althusser and The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. I know these essays are difficult and strange and old and hard to understand, so hopefully I can break it down a little bit and things make some more sense. So the reason that I had you read these essays is because I think that both of them can help us answer this question um, of why is literary analysis important. I think that this is a question that we have to try to answer if we're going to write this kind of essay. I think it's a question that hasn't been given much attention to the past. I think we've written about plays and stories, but we've never really thought about why we would write these essays or why anyone would read them or why it even matters. So so because of that, I think it's hard to care about them, to try really harder to really make them good pieces of writing. I think we need to have the answer to this to make a better essay. So let's start with the Althusser and let's see how what he said could possibly fit into this. So in Ideological State Apparatuses by Louis Althusser, I only gave you a couple of pages of this. It's from a much longer book. I didn't want you to have to read any more of that. So I just gave you a couple of pages. But what he's trying to do in that essay in his larger book is he's trying to give us a theory of how governments or how the state stays in power. So he's doing this kind of like general theoretical stuff about how do governments work, how does power work. So the basic question, the way that I would ask this if we were in class, is if there was an overthrow of the government, right? If there's a new government in charge and you were put in charge of it, what would you need to do to stay in power? He's not talking specifically about America or France or any other country. He's saying in general. So if you were in charge, what would you do to make sure you stay in power and someone doesn't overthrow you? So I think the immediate answer to this that most people will give is that you need the military. You need an army to make sure that someone else doesn't overthrow you. You need the police. You need people who are going to back you. You need the force to back up being in charge. Um, so this all has to do with violence, right? And I think prisons would also go in there. You need military, you need police, you need prisons if you want to make sure that no one else is going to overthrow you if you're at the top of the government. So all this stuff is what Althusser refers to um, as the repressive state apparatus. Okay, so I think that much seems obvious, right? I think that makes sense. If you were in charge of the government, what would you want to do to stay in power? You would need the police or the army to back you up, right? So that seems kind of basic. What Althusser adds, the reason that, he's famous for the essay and what I want us to get from him has to do with the other way that people stay in power that he mentions, which is the ideological state apparatuses. Apparatuses. Tough to spell. Eventually, he abbreviates the ISAs, thankfully. Um, so what does this mean? Ideological state apparatus. What is he talking about? So this word ideology, I think we've mentioned it before in the class. It's a little bit confusing. So let's just take a step back. What do we mean by ideology? Ideology is kind of like a belief system. An ideology is kind of like, it's not one belief. It's kind of a bunch of beliefs that go together, that support each other, that they kind of make a web, that form a whole system of beliefs, that form really like a worldview. So that's what ideology is. So he says that there's ideological state apparatuses. He says there's ways, basically, that the state tries to advocate for certain belief systems, that the people in power want you to believe certain things, basically, which I think makes sense, which I think is something that we all know is true. So a couple other things that he says here. One is that the government, whatever state or government is in charge, is the government of the ruling class. The class is in economics, right? Basically, that there's an economic class who is the main class that controls the government. In our society, this is rich people, right? This is people who make a lot of money. They're the ones who the government's interest works in. The government works in their interest the most. So the next thing that Althusser has for us is that there is a certain ideology, a certain belief system or worldview that goes along with the government or the state. That there is the ideology of the ruling class, he calls it. Basically, that there's a set of beliefs that benefit the people in power, that the people in power have, right? Okay, we'll return to this. I know it's a little confusing. So let's go to some of the examples that he gives of ideological state apparatuses. Some of them are schools, he says family, religion, media, like the press. He says culture. I think those are some of the big ones. So what could this mean? Why would these things be ideological state apparatuses? None of these are really part of the state. Maybe schools, like, kind of, right? Some schools are run by the state, but most of these things are not run by the state the way that the military, the police, and the prisons are. So how does he go about making them ideological state apparatuses? Basically, Althusser is trying to say that there's ways that all of these things try to get us to believe things that ultimately benefit the government or the people in power. That all of these things in our lives get us to buy into a belief system that's beneficial to keeping things how they are. How could this work? Well, let's look at schools first. I think schools maybe is the most obvious one. What do schools really teach us? Yes, they teach us some math, they teach us some reading, they teach us some good things. But what kind of traits do you really have to get a good grade in K through 12 school? Well, basically you need to be obedient. You need to, sit when they tell you to sit, do what the teacher says, hand things in on time. You need to be punctual, right? Those are kind of the main things that help you get a good grade when you're, in seventh grade or something like that. And it's what the school system really teaches us. So I think we could see how being punctual or obedient would help the government or the state, and by that, by extension, the ruling class, by extension, rich people. Um, if we are obedient, punctual, we do what we're told, we're paying attention, you're just kind of a cog in the machine, keeping things going how they are, not threatening to upset anything. Because remember that we started this by saying, how can the government stay in power? How can they keep things the way they are? How can they stay on top? So I think we can see how that works with schools. Some of these other ones are maybe a little murkier. Religion seems like a weird one, and I don't want to, be like anti-religion or anything like that. I'm not trying to say anything anti-religion. Um, but I think one reason that he puts religion here, definitely obedience, goes along with certain kinds of religion. Definitely, I'll speak about Christianity, what I grew up with. They definitely teach you to be obedient. And even past that, I think you could think about something like the afterlife, which is, something that shows up in many religions. So let's think about this: the afterlife. In Christianity, they say that the afterlife, if you suffered in this life, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. There's all these sayings. The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last. All of these kinds of things. Basically, that if you're suffering now, you'll get rewarded in the afterlife. So my question would be that if you believe that, are you going to, try to overthrow the government or something to make things better right now? Maybe, and some have tried to in the name of religion. But I think we can see how the idea of an afterlife kind of tells you that everything is fine how it is. You'll be rewarded eventually. Just take your suffering, do your part, and everything will be fine. I think that's what we see with a lot of things that support the status quo, the ideology of the ruling class. It's kind of like everything's fine is sort of the mantra of all of it. Okay, so religion, schools, really culture is the one that I'm interested in here. Because one of the things that he mentions under culture is art, which is ultimately why we're reading this essay, right? How does this fit in with our literary analysis? Well, he lists art as being one of the things involved here. So how would this work? Basically, the claim would be that art can either support or go against a belief system of the ruling class. the belief system that helps keep things the way they are that benefits rich people and the ruling class the most. How could this happen? One way, one kind of story that I think fits in here is the rags to riches story. This is not a specific story; it's a type of story. There's a lot of these. Cinderella is one of these. If you've seen the movie Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, it's kind of one of these where the character starts out with nothing at the beginning. They're poor, they're homeless, they're desolate, they have nothing going for them. But they're able to work hard and eventually rise to the top of society. Because of how hard they worked and all the hard work they put in, they're able to rise up. This is the rags to riches story. A lot of athletes have this. LeBron James tells a story like this. We see this a lot in our culture. This rags to riches story it keeps showing up again and again. It's also very much related to the idea of the American dream. And both of these are about social mobility, about the idea that you can rise up in society, that you can start poor and become rich. And why is that important? It's important for the ruling class. It's important to them that you would think this, that you would think that there's a lot of people can start poor and become rich. Because if that's true, then everything's fine. Then there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the system as we have it set up. If you can start out totally poor and end up totally rich. Now, as we know, it's, the vast minority of people that are able to start out that poor and really become rich. That the percentages are that most people end up similar to where they started out in life. So this story is not really true. Like, it's true for some people, but it's not to be expected. It's not what happens most of the time. So I think one reason that we see so many of these stories when it's not represented in real life all that often is because it ultimately fits in with the worldview of the ruling class, the belief system of the ruling class. So this would be a way that Althusser would analyze this story. He would say that the story, the rags to riches story, the story about the American dream, is ultimately doing the work of the ruling class by telling you that, our society's totally fine. It's great. When really, in fact, we know that it's not, and there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of inequality and everything like that. So this can go the other way too. If stories that are, for the American dream end up benefiting the ruling class and the government, there can also be stories that are against the American dream. For instance, I think we mentioned Of Mice and Men before in class. That's a story that, tries to tell us the American dream is not really what we're told it is, what it's cracked up to be. If you remember in that story, they're always talking about trying to get their own farm, right? George and Lenny are trying to get their own farm where Lenny's gonna tend the rabbits, he's gonna pet the rabbits. And they never actually get it. Instead, George shoots Lenny in the head. So if we think about that, in that case, the farm is kind of like the American dream for them. And they never get it. That's what that story tells us, is that this American dream, kind of bullshit, not really going to happen. Instead, you just get shot in the back of the head. So I think we can see how that would be a story that's against the American dream. So, if that was the case, then it would also be against the interests of the government, the ruling class, and rich people, really. This is the way that Althusser would look at art, and these are the kind of arguments that we can make from this point of view. That certain pieces of art are either supporting the belief system, the worldview of the ruling class, or going against it. Because he thinks that if we don't like the way things are, if we're trying to change how our society is set up, he thinks that the ideological state apparatus is the place to start. Why? Because if you just go and try to attack, the military, if you just go try to fight the police, how is that going to go for you? It's not going to go well. So he thinks that the place to start, if what we ultimately want is to change who's in power and who the government works for, the way to start is through the ideological state apparatuses, through things like art and the rest of the stuff that he has here. Basically, the way to start is to change people's minds. That if you try to go with physical force immediately, it's not going to work out. They have tanks and stuff. So basically, you have to try to change the way that people think first. And he thinks that art, again, is capable of doing this. It's one of the things that either get us to buy into the belief system of the ruling class or to go against it. So it's also the way to go against all this stuff. So that's how Althusser stuff relates to art. It's kind of trying to show us how art can sometimes be like propaganda for or against the government or the ruling class and the way our society is. So really that just gives us an answer to why it's important, right? Because if this is true, then, if you're someone who cares about the state of the world, then this is something that you would have to care about. So let's move on to Freud and see what he has to say here. Okay, so this is about Freud's the interpretation of dreams. So right off the bat, this is gonna have something to do with dreams. Some of you might be familiar with Freud's thoughts on dreams. Maybe you've seen it in a psychology class before. It's one of the things that I think Freud was pretty right about. There's a lot of things he was wrong about. Definitely a lot of stuff he said about gender was super harmful and really bad. Uh, and famously cocaine addict, right? Um, but I think he was kind of right about dreams. So as you might remember, his basic idea about dreams is separating the conscious from the subconscious. So basically, the way that he explains dreams is that they are things that are in the subconscious that we can't really deal with consciously because they're too painful, and then instead we kind of bury them, right? To use another of his terms, these are things that get repressed into the subconscious or the unconscious, and then in dreams they kind of come back to us. Freud also writes about how the different ways that dreams were interpreted in the past. He says that, a really long time ago, thousands of years, people used to think that dreams were premonitions or that they could tell the future, that they would show you what's going to happen. Um, and then as time goes on, people got more scientific, and then they said, well, dreams don't mean anything at all. They're just kind of random stuff that you saw during the day that just pops back up while you're sleeping for no real reason. And that's kind of what people believed until Freud came along. And he said, well, it's not that they're the future, but they're also not nothing. They can tell us something about ourselves. Uh, so really, he thought that they were a way to look at, to find out about the things that we were, like anxious about, or our desires, or the things that we were scared of, or things that were traumatic for us that we just couldn't deal with. So that's his ideas about dreams that I think are right, and I think make a lot of sense. So, just to use some of the language he uses in the essay. So the conscious part, what he talks about in the essay, he calls the manifest content of the dream. And similar to the subconscious, he uses the latent content of the dream. So basically, what he means by manifest and latent is that manifest are the things that happen in the dream, and that latent is kind of like the deeper meaning. And he admits that it's always kind of a challenge to connect the manifest to the latent, and that you're never totally sure if you're right, and that there's more than one answer sometimes. So it's a lot like analyzing art in that way. So to give an example, a dream that a lot of people had. Have you ever had the dream where something happens to your teeth, where either your teeth are falling out, or they break, or there's some kind of problem with them? I've had this. I think for me, it's been like looking in the mirror and I'm just missing like half of my front teeth or something like that. It's a terrible dream. If you've had it, I'm sorry. If you haven't, that's great. Good for you. It's a terrible dream, right? So just using this as an example, why do we have this dream? What is this dream really about? The manifest content is something happening to your teeth. But is that really what we're worried about? Are we actually worried about something happening to our teeth? I don't think so. Probably not. So a popular reading of this dream is it has something to do with stress, right? Think about it. Teeth are something that you can't control. If you have a problem with your teeth, it's a really big deal, and there's kind of nothing that you can do about it. So I think this dream has something to do with being overwhelmed or stress or something like that. So the latent content would be something like that. It would be stress. And what are you stressed about? Well, I don't know. You're probably stressed about like money or like family or something like that. Really, you're not worried about anything going on with your teeth. You're worried about these other things. But it just shows up as something bad happening to your teeth, them falling out or breaking or whatever. Um, why does this happen? Why does it show up as a teeth dream instead of just a dream about money? Freud says because it's too painful for us to actually confront the problem, so our brain, turns it into something more palatable. So that's why we end up with the dream about teeth. I think this is right. So, what does this mean for art? How does this connect with art to art? So there's a couple of ways. One, I think it provides, kind of a comparison where in art, the story itself, the things that happen in the story are similar to our conscious brain, are similar to the manifest content of the dream. And then the message of the story, which we've been talking about a lot, finding the message, making arguments about the message of a story, is similar to the subconscious part or the latent content, the deeper meaning. So the same way that you have to kind of uncode a dream to figure out what it's really about, you have to uncode a story to figure out the message that it's trying to send. Um, Beyond that, looking at dreams the way that Freud does, thinking about them as being part of the subconscious, it tells us something about the individual, right? It can tell us what you're worried about, or your ambitions, or your anxieties. Um, the thing about looking at art is that instead of telling us about one individual, which that can be important if it's you want to know about yourself, but ultimately what the psychology of one individual doesn't matter that much to everyone. By looking at art, we can find out about the collective psychology. By looking at different pieces of art, we can find out what the anxieties and desires of a whole society are or were. Um, I think about this with shows about technology, like for instance Black Mirror or something like that. Like you could see by looking at shows like that, how anxious people are right now about technology and how it's advancing and what it's going to be and everything like that. So by looking at art, we can find out something about the collective psychology of the culture as a whole. And I think there's a lot of value to that. I think that can tell us important things and help us understand all of us better. So that's kind of the argument with the Freud stuff, that art is important because it can tell us something about collective psychology, and it gives us a nice way of thinking about how the message shows up in a story, the same way that the latent content of a dream shows up in the dream itself. So those are my answers for why literary analysis might be important. I think there's important things to get out of it, and these two essays have tried to show us that. So hopefully that makes sense. Send me some questions about this because this stuff is definitely super confusing. These essays are really tough. So send me some more questions about this because I really do want us to have a good understanding of why these kinds of essays matter. Because I think without that, it's going to be really hard to write a good one. So thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.